Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Rui, Director of Foreign Policy here at GINSA. I'll be moderating today's webinar on the lessons from past Gaza conflicts as we await what appears could potentially be a large-scale Israeli operation into the Gaza Strip. Before we dive in, I'd like to point out to our audience that GINSA is issuing regular updates on events on the ground in Israel and Gaza, and we just put out a comprehensive list of policy recommendations for the Biden administration and Congress to bolster Israel's self-defense and curtail the risks of a potentially broader conflict driven by Hezbollah and Iran. You can find all of that on GINSA's website. Today, we're privileged to be joined by two members of GINSA's Gaza assessment team, which has produced comprehensive reports on the operational, legal, and associated challenges of both the 2014 and 2021 Gaza conflicts between Israel and Hamas. I'm joined today by Lieutenant General Tom Trask, who is former Vice Commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. He has also served on a number of GINSA policy projects, including our fact-finding mission to Israel in 2021 in the wake of Israel's most recent large-scale conflict with Hamas. Jeff Korn is the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law at the Texas Tech University School of Law. He previously served as a U.S. Army officer, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He has been an invaluable resource at the heart of GINSA's examinations of recent Gaza conflicts and of a prospective future Israel-Hezbollah conflict. And on that last note, I would like to point out to our audience that in 2018, our hybrid warfare policy project produced a report examining similar operational and legal considerations of what we call Israel's next northern war, looking at a potential major conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon and potentially farther afield, something that seems to have become increasingly imaginable since Saturday's events. Just to frame today's discussion, I'd like to share with everyone one overarching takeaway from most of our work on these topics, which is that despite the Israel Defense Forces, or the IDF, often going to significant lengths to comply with the law of armed conflict, or LOAC as we call it, and despite its adversaries like Hamas intentionally abusing and exploiting those same laws, Hamas and others usually win out in the court of public opinion and successfully generate international pressure on Israel to delegitimize and terminate its lawful operations. Obviously, there's lots to get to today, but I'll just remind our audience to type any questions you have into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those in turn. So, General Trask, I'd like to start with you to lay out the operational picture here, which we can then use to tee up Professor Korn to explain some of the legal complexities of what we might be seeing. So, General Trask, as a potential large-scale combined arms IDF operation into Gaza could be imminent, could you give our audience a basic outline or sense of the operational difficulties posed by Gaza and Hamas's operations therein? And what are some of the key considerations the IDF will have to take into account in terms of planning and conducting an operation in Gaza?
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. Really kind of goes back to the work that we did 2 years ago on the latest Guardian of the Wall operation in 2021, and our report at that time predicted that conflict was likely to be not too far down the road. I probably didn't think it would be this quickly after that operation. But because of the strategy mismatch that we saw at that time, and it's kind of a key part of the operational assessment of that report, where Hamas and the IDF had strategies that were such that both could be accomplished, yet really neither one could change the situation that led to the conflict in the first place. And what I mean by that is Hamas really was only trying to win in the court of public opinion, to build support for themselves and to discredit the IDF. That was the purpose of the attacks at the time, as well as to win favor with the rest of the Palestinian community, particularly in the West Bank at that time, and show that it was Hamas that was carrying the flag for the Palestinians. And largely they accomplished that objective in the 2021 operation, even though the large majority of their rockets were either intercepted or missed targets, and the damage was very minimal, particularly as compared to this operation. At the same time, the IDF's strategy was simply to reduce the capabilities that Hamas had inside Gaza. And with the extreme measures that they took to avoid civilian casualties in that operation, they basically gave up the initiative in many cases. And though they were able to, we estimated about a 25% reduction in the report 2 years ago. In rockets, we still estimated that even at that time, there was still 20,000 left, and they've had 2 years to continue to acquire more and build more. So we knew that that only had a marginal effect. So operationally, it didn't really change the situation on the ground. One of the things that we did note up militarily was that the IDF had been able to really stop any effective use of tunneling out of Gaza. The technology had come to a point where it was really difficult and unusual that Hamas was able to successfully tunnel into Israel, and that was the way that they launched incursions. So the interesting thing to me in this most recent conflict was the lessons that were learned by Hamas. They realized the tunnels didn't work. They realized they had to find other ways to attack. They also realized that the intelligence the Israelis were getting was extremely good. They knew where most of the Hamas operators were. They knew phone numbers. They were able to, and that's how they were able to warn civilians when they attacked in Gaza in that operation. So Hamas had to realize that they couldn't use their same methods of communication, and their operation security, or OPSEC, in this operation has been far better than it has in any other time. The fact that they were able to surprise the Israelis with a ground incursion through the border, it was surprising to me. I'm sure it was surprising to the Israeli citizens near the border and to the IDF themselves, because I think there was a feeling that, hey, we know where they are, what they're doing most of the time. So whether you call it an intel failure, I'm not sure I go to that extreme. Yeah, I have to know that there was actually some intelligence that could have been found, or was it just really good operation security on the part of a small group of Hamas? It's a type of operation where you don't need the bulk of the organization to know about it. And in fact, the smaller the group, the better, and the more likely you can protect it. But it's another example of Hamas learning. And it begs the questions, what else have they learned? They had to realize that this type of operation may create a different response than the one in 2021 or in 2014. So what have they done to prepare for that? And I'm sure the IDF is working on that question right now, but it creates a situation where right now, if the IDF is considering a ground invasion in order to further reduce Hamas, or potentially to occupy Gaza again, it's going to be some new questions they will have to answer on the capability of Hamas to, one, have operation security to better defend against that situation, and what else do they have as far as capabilities. So it's a tough question. It's going to be, if they choose to take that route, it is going to be a very difficult urban fight against an enemy that we saw 2 years ago, has no hesitation to put civilians out in front of them to protect them. So the choices that the IDF will have to make will be extremely difficult. Then you add the consideration of the hostages that are being held there. And how do you go about taking care of that situation? Do you try to solve that first, or do you try to do it all in one fell swoop? But it greatly complicates the operational challenges for the IDF going in.
Thank you, General. And you touched upon several things over the course of your remarks that I'll want to come back to later on in our talk, including the hostage issue, and then also the issue of the strategic questions beyond just the operational picture of as you mentioned, the strategic mismatch between Hamas and Israel, and then also sort of what a strategic end state may look like. But before we get to all that, I think Professor Corey and General Trask sort of teed up some of the operational difficulties that await Israel in Gaza. But before we even get to that, I'd like to start off with a sort of a more fundamental question, which is, could you explain to us sort of how you would assess the legality of Israel's response to this Hamas attack? How wide is the scope of Israel's legal self-defense, given that this response, or given that this attack from Hamas was worse than we've seen in memory, and then also given that at least what we're hearing from Israeli leaders is that their approach to this operation may be almost categorically different than what we've seen in 14 and 21, let alone the smaller conflicts.
Well, I mean, let's start with a basic fact, and that is if you do a proportional comparison, what Israel suffered on Saturday would be analogous to the United States losing 45,000 people in one attack from an organized armed group. And I don't think there's anybody in the world who would doubt for a second that our response would be swift, aggressive, and unusual in terms of other actions we've taken. There has been widespread, not universal, as we know, widespread international recognition that Israel is entitled to act in self-defense. That's a right that derives from its status as a state and a member of the international community. It's enshrined in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations that states have an inherent right of self-defense. There are, of course, some states that argue that Israel is culpable for the situation, and therefore in criminal law terms, we would say they have dirty hands and they don't have a right to claim self-defense, but I think they're certainly outliers and predictable outliers. The real question and the real debate that we've seen before is there'll be an initial acknowledgement of a right to self-defense, and then you'll start hearing this phrase proportionality. And you'll start hearing critics raise concerns that the scope, duration, and scale of the military response is not consistent with the requirement that any act in self-defense be proportional. And I think that will reveal significant misunderstandings of the basic principles of self-defense. The most fundamental principle is the principle of necessity. The state is permitted to do all that it reasonably determines is necessary to prevent the violence, to restore the situation of national security. And in fact, you know that in the past, I've argued that I think in prior incidents, Israel would have been legally justified in taking more aggressive action. And they made a political and diplomatic choice not to accept the continuing threat on their border on the expectation that they would be able to manage that threat. That expectation has been thrown to the wind. And so self-defense is not a tit-for-tat equation. So let's resist that. There's no rule that says if they fire 10 rockets, you're allowed to fire 10 rockets. If they kill 100 civilians, you're allowed to kill 100 civilians. The principle of self-defense is that I can take self-help to terminate or eliminate the ongoing threat to my national security. And in this situation, considering the gravity of the attack and the ongoing capability of an enemy that now seems emboldened, I think from a strategic standpoint, it is certainly legally permissible to give the IDF the mission of destroying the military capabilities of this organized armed group so that the security of the state can be restored.
So to sort of follow from that question and sort of drill down, go from the legality of the war to the legality in the war. One thing that you've written about in our reports and certainly elsewhere is sort of what you call effects-based condemnations, which is, people look at the outcome of a particular attack or strike and base the legality of it sort of looking retrospectively that way. And certainly we're already seeing that play out in social and other media since Saturday. So I guess could you sort of unpack that in the terms of, basically what's Hamas's strategic playbook here? Ask General Trask about the more operational dimensions. Basically what is, as we assess, Israel's operations are often lawful and Hamas seek to exploit that for strategic advantage. Could you sort of unpack that for our audience in terms of the legality of IDF versus Hamas operations?
Well, let's start with a basic principle of the law of war or the law of armed conflict. The rules related to conducting attacks, targeting, are not effects oriented. I don't go to General Trask and say, you're not allowed to kill any civilians. I go to General Trask and I say, you are not allowed to deliberately try to kill civilians, and you're obligated to do everything that's feasible to mitigate the risk when you're attacking a legitimate target. The moral clarity here is simple. There's one party to this conflict that is deliberately trying to kill civilians, and I would argue they're deliberately trying to kill their own civilians, using Israeli attacks as the means to do it. And there's another side of the conflict that's trying not to kill civilians. So that right there explains why it is distorting and pernicious to make judgments about the legality of an attack decision by looking at the outcome, the destruction or the death, especially when you're fighting an enemy. You know, people know the phrase human shielding. Human shielding is a war crime. It's illegal to use civilians in an effort to shield your targets, but that presupposes your motive is to prevent the attack. You know that I've written that I think that in many cases, Hamas uses civilians because they want the Israelis to attack the target, because they want the civilians to be killed, they want the facilities to be destroyed, so they have visceral images that they can use in their strategic information campaign to start to convince people that the IDF is indifferent towards civilian casualties, is illegal in the conduct of its operations. That puts pressure on the Israeli government to stop the operation. So I think, in my view, that's one strategic objective. As General Jones, one of our former colleagues, said once, for US and Israeli forces, information is a supporting effort to combat. For Hamas, combat is a supporting effort to their information campaign. And I think the other point, and the general made this point, is that they know they can't defeat the IDF, but they can inflict substantial pain on the IDF. And their view is if they can cause that level of pain, it will make the Israeli government more hesitant to continue the operation and to do it again in the future. So don't allow anybody to play the game of, oh, look at that destruction, that must be a war crime. That's like saying 1 plus I don't know equals 9. You have to know what the target was, why it was attacked, what the assessment of civilian risk was, what measures did the commander implement to mitigate the risk. And I'm confident that the Israeli Defense Forces know this, and that their leaders at every level are going to be making a good faith effort to mitigate civilian risk. But when you're fighting an enemy that puts its military assets in the midst of the civilian population, they're not immune from attack. And that puts a terrible, terrible toll and burden on the shoulders of the commanders who have to make these difficult decisions.
Hey, Jonathan, can I jump
General,
on? I
please,
think it
yes.
might be good to kind of highlight the operational methods that were used 2 years ago. And of course, I don't have the same access that we got during our trip in 2021 to how it's going right now, but I assume they've started with that and then made adjustments. But just for everyone to understand, and the details are in our report from 2 years ago, when the IDF struck targets inside Gaza, they went to such extreme measures that it was a surprise to the American officers, because it was far beyond anything that we do in the U.S. military as far as trying to prevent civilian casualties. They would, before every strike, they would drop leaflets in the area to say that they were going to hit a specific target. They knew that Hamas was using hospitals and schools to store weapons and to hide operators, but they would tell everybody in the area. Then they normally had cell phones. They would do mass texts and phone calls to tell the residents of a building that their building was about to be hit. Then they developed a very small precision munition that would hit the roof of the building 5 minutes before the strike to give the inhabitants the last warning that they were about to hit that target. And even after all that, if they still, through their surveillance capabilities, saw that there were civilians on the target, they would cancel the strike. That is far beyond anything that is expected, or is even anything beyond what the United States typically has done in theaters like Afghanistan or Iraq over the last 20 years. I don't expect that they're going to be able to. What they probably learned from that was they were only able to complete marginal reductions in Hamas capability by doing that. It is a more serious event this time. I don't expect they're going to be taking that same tactic this time, and that's one of the things I think that's probably changed this time versus 2 years ago.
By the way, one quick comment, Jonathan.
Please.
That point, right? Isn't it interesting that in many cases, the video of a building coming down is being taken by people on the street, civilians on the street? What does that tell you? They knew it was coming. They got away from it. Now compare that to Russian attacks in Ukraine. When Russia starts bombarding Ukraine, do you see a lot of civilians hanging around on the street to videotape the incident? No, they're all running for cover because it's a surprise and they don't know what the scope of the attack will be. The way information is actually gathered in response to IDF strikes is objective evidence that the civilians in the area know about them and have been told to evacuate.
I thank you for raising that point, General Trask, Professor Korn. One thing we saw in the 2021 conflict, and I think we've seen more of it since Saturday, is because the IDF takes these precautions, like the knock on the roof, all the international media in Gaza knows which building to point their cameras at well in advance of when it's coming down. And we've also seen in previous conflicts evidence of when that knock on the roof comes, Hamas trying to force civilians into the building, perversely in the direct opposite effect of what the IDF is trying to achieve. And I just want to note for our audience a comment that stuck with me ever since we did our assessment of the 2014 Gaza conflict in a report I recommend you all read on JINSA's website. It came out in 2015. I remember one of the retired U.S. flag officers on that trip mentioned, the Israelis fight with one hand tied behind their back, and we would never permit our forces to do the same thing. Which that has stuck with me for a long time. And as we note in our report, the IDF often sacrifices some tactical and operational effectiveness as a result of those precautions. So we have some interest from the audience in the hostage issue, and I want to jump to that in a second, but I just want to continue the current discussion with one more question. I'll pose it to both of you, I guess, Professor Korn first. So we've heard about how Israel's efforts to comply with the law of armed conflict and Hamas's, but in this case, Hamas's efforts to abuse them. So in that case, how is Hamas effective if it's the one intentionally exploiting the law and Israel's the one trying to comply with it? Logically, you'd think Israel would win in the court of public opinion there, but as we've often found in our reports, it's perversely the direct opposite. So, how do we get from the law of armed conflict compliance to Israel often losing at least the war, if not the battle?
Well, first off, let's just acknowledge something that's indisputable. The international response to conflict is the bigotry of dual expectations, right? And it's not something that's limited to just Israel. We face it as well. And you talk about fighting with our hands tied behind our back. I think the general would say there are many cases where our respect for the law requires us to make compromises in military action, but we do that because it is who we are. It's central to the moral foundation of the institution, and it's central to the moral foundation of command and leadership. Soldiers understand if you come from a moral society, they don't want to operate under commanders who are completely indifferent to the human suffering of war. And commanders know that they have an obligation to protect not just the physical integrity of the warrior, but also the moral integrity. And the law plays that role. So outside of the strategic information campaign, let's not make the mistake of saying, well, if you're fighting an enemy that is barbaric, you should be able to resort to barbaric means, because that's corrosive to the very notion of good order and discipline and moral war fighting. As oxymoronic as that term may sound, there is morality in war, and there are clear lines, and good commanders and good leaders demand of their subordinates that they respect those lines. How does Hamas win? I think it's simple. There is a persistent and illogical conflation between the why of conflict and the how of conflict. So Hamas wins because when you hear people already condemning Israel, they're not condemning Israel so much because of the conduct of hostilities. they're condemning them because of a 60-year occupation, and they've turned Gaza into the world's biggest prison in the world, and the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. And my view is, the right to self-determination, do they have a right to their own state? That may be completely legitimate, but that has nothing to do with how you fight. And this is a fundamental principle of the law. We don't look at why you're fighting to dictate the rules of how you fight. And I think that the initial attack and the barbarism, I have one friend who's a law professor in Minnesota, and he was in the IDF. He was a paratrooper as a young man, and he put something on Facebook yesterday. He said, "Stop calling them animals. It's disrespectful to animals. Animals don't kill for pleasure." Okay? This level of barbarism, I think, has had a backlash. And there are people now who are recognizing that even if you have a sympathy for the Palestinian cause writ large, you cannot have sympathy for the manner in which they conduct the operations. But the way this ends up losing is the David and Goliath narrative, that Israel is all powerful, that it can do whatever it wants, and it needs to kind of calm down and let things settle. And we're already seeing that from some of our politicians. There are two questions here. The first is, do you have a right to self-defense? And the answer is yes. And the second is, what side is trying to respect humanity in the execution of operations, and what side has a complete disregard? And on that ledger, the answer is clear and simple.
So thank you for that, Professor Korn. I think one of the values of these policy projects that you both have served on is that, in addition to laying out the complex operational considerations, we do an excellent job of explaining the legal complexities in ways that lay people such as myself can understand. I want to pivot slightly because it's a salient issue, and we've gotten some interest from our audience. General Trask, I'll start with you, but General Korn, please feel free to jump in as well. General Trask, can you talk about what abilities the U.S. has in terms of the hostage situation and rescue in Gaza? I know we've heard reports that there are sort of, for lack of a better term, U.S. advisors sort of consulting with their Israeli counterparts. How would that collaboration, how might it play out, and what would an IDF rescue mission potentially look like?
Yeah, obviously, the U.S. has some of the best capability in the world, but there are only a few nations that have close or equivalent capabilities, and one of them is Israel. So as far as the capability, a force that's prepared to do this type of operation, Israel is always hesitant to take much help from anybody. However, the key to success in this type of operation is going to be intelligence, and whether or not you can build the story to create a mission to be successful. It's going to be really difficult, and it kind of goes back to what I said before. The operational security that Hamas demonstrated in their raids across the border tells me that they will be able to do this in a way and hold these hostages in a way that it's going to be really difficult to find out where they are. You've got to have some idea how they're being held, where they're being held, what the threat is in that area, to have any hope of penetrating such an urban environment to go after and rescue hostages. The Israelis have shown in the past that they won't hesitate to use more brute measures to do that, because sometimes that's the only way to get to these targets, and of course that increases the risk for the civilian hostages when you have to go to that. So I would think it would take some time to build the intelligence packages necessary for successful hostage rescue operations. I know there's a part of the society in Israel that's clamoring for an immediate attempt to rescue them, and it's just not reasonable to do that until you've had the time to build up sufficient intelligence to go after that. But that is one of the areas where collaboration between the U.S. and Israel is possible, where we put intelligence capabilities and sources together to try to build the target folders that you would need to successfully accomplish something like that.
Or Professor Korn, is there anything you'd like to add on the hostage issue?
One thing I think that's interesting to watch has been the silence of the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. Let's not forget that the Palestinian Authority has requested and been accepted as a member of that court, which means that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction on any war crimes that occur in Gaza, in Palestinian territory. And you're talking about some of the most blatant war crimes in the charter of the International Criminal Court: hostage taking, murder of civilians, deliberately attacking civilians, and there's been crickets. This is not going to be a whodunit case. If you get the people who mutilated children in a kibbutz, that's not a whodunit. This is not a complex question of whether you were attacking a legitimate target. The ICC prosecutor on this hostage issue should be one of the voices emphasizing that there will be an investigation and indictments for not just the individuals who took the hostages, but all of Hamas leadership who bear command responsibility for this misconduct.
So there's still much more to get to. I would want to sort of, we focused on some of the more immediate legal and operational challenges and uncertainties at hand. Given, as we said at the outset, and as General Trask, as you said in your opening remarks, there's sort of, in previous conflicts, we've seen the IDF has intentionally, sought to limit both its ends and its means in the hopes of, restoring deterrence, buying peace and quiet. And we certainly saw that, especially since the 2021 conflict, where it seemed as though Israel and Hamas reached at least some sort of tacit détente or understanding where, quiet for quiet, and try to incentivize Hamas to avoid further attacks. Obviously, that is certainly out the window at this point. But I guess this is something we've raised in our past reports, and certainly it's something we're getting interest from the audience now. Is what potentially might a strategic end state look like, or potentially how are the considerations different now than it's been in past conflicts, where as we mentioned in our reports, Israel's goals are more limited in short term?
Yeah, let me kind of go back to the discussion on operational objectives on both sides. So from a Hamas perspective, it's easy to look and go, what could they have been thinking to with this small attack, by creating such public civilian casualties that they had to know was going to go out to the world? I don't think that their objectives were different. I think they were the same as they were 2 years ago, which was simply to delegitimize Israel and to build their own stead in the Palestinian world. But I think they overstepped their goals in this regard. Certainly, there is great support across the globe right now for the Palestinians in general. That always will come up. It'll always be there. But if you look, I think there's more support for Israel this time than there have been in the last two conflicts. Capitals around the world that are blue and white, that are supporting Israel publicly, immediately, that in a way that it didn't happen 2 years ago or in 2014. Is that a result of the Israelis taking the lessons that we wrote 2 years ago, where we said, hey, you need to talk about the law of armed conflict and make people understand exactly what Professor Korn was going through? That was one of our recommendations in the report, that you have to put that out publicly. And then you also have to talk about it with each of the strikes as you go along. If you read the report from 2 years ago, the big lesson was the Al Jalal building that was hit, that housed Al Jazeera, that had a very sensitive Hamas target inside. And our recommendation was the IDF could have used their information campaign to make sure that everyone in the world knew exactly what that was before we woke up the next morning to hear the Israelis had bombed an Al Jazeera press building, which is how the story came out. I think the IDF is doing better in telling that story this time. But I really think the change in the additional support for Israel is more because Hamas has kind of overstepped their goals. So then folks switch it over to what are the Israeli objectives? I don't know that they're going to change the objective. I think they're going to realize, and from a geostrategic perspective, they might change the objectives if Gaza was the biggest problem that they had. but it's not. The existential threat to Israel is not through Gaza. It's on the northern border and it's through Iran. And that is the focus of Israel. And they will not let their focus shift to make Gaza the most important thing. They'll take large actions and they will focus on it, but they're not pulling forces off the northern border to do it. They realize that that's where the bigger threat is. For that reason, I don't think they're going to change the objective, which is to degrade significantly the capability of Hamas inside Gaza. I think they'll probably realize that the way they did it 2 years ago did not sufficiently degrade that capability, and that they're going to have to go in on the ground and really make sure that they have a very significant degradation. And then I think they'll pull back out, leave it to Hamas, invite the Arab world to come in and fix the problem. There are people calling for an occupation of Gaza. That becomes such a resource draining, time consuming thing to own one of the most broken areas on the planet. And I think I'm hoping that they'll reach out to the rest of the Arab world, that the successes of the Abraham Accords will come into play, that there'll be some other kind of capability or force that comes from the Arab world to come in and try to fix the problem inside Gaza once Israel feels that they've comfortably degraded Hamas military capability to an extent where they can pull back out and feel safe.
I would thank you for that, General Trask, and I would refer everyone to the closing section of our 2015 report, in which we sort of address head on the damned if you do, damned if you don't dilemma facing the Israelis in terms of their end state objectives in Gaza. Is it a more limited operation that reduces the risk and potential long-term costs to Israel of, as you mentioned, General Trask, an occupation in one of the world's most hostile environments? Or do they indeed go back in and try to root out Hamas, remove it as a political and military actor for the foreseeable future, but with the attendant cost of, as you said, something like an occupation there? I want to sort of get to this issue. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but the issue of Professor Korn, what you've called strategic patience. In previous Gaza operations, we've seen that given Israel's ability through Iron Dome and other capabilities to reduce the immediate threat of direct cost to Israeli forces and the homeland, but that's in dealing with sort of the past Gaza threat. I'd be curious if you think that that equation changes in this operation, and then also, as we mentioned, there's a very real possibility of a northern war on the horizon. And if you could sort of, I guess, brace our listeners for what strategic patience, if that's even a consideration in a northern war.
Well, I mean, the Northern War report we did, the main focus of it was that if they have to fight Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel, they're not going to have the luxury of that strategic patience, because it's a myth to believe that Iron Dome is a complete defensive shield over the nation of Israel. And so I think, ironically, what Hamas did with its barrage operations initially validated our conclusions about the Northern Front, which is, once the system starts to become overwhelmed, what do you have to do as a leader? You have to prioritize your high-value targets, your airport, your ports, your vital military facilities, and you leave who vulnerable? You leave the civilian population vulnerable. The limits of defense, right? General Trask knows this better than I do, but the limits of a defensive posture have once again been exposed. I mean, this is why there are historians and people who lived through the Yom Kippur War saying this is like the Bar-Lev line all over again. We can build a defensive shield and sit comfortably behind it, not when you have an adaptive enemy that's looking for ways to bypass your defenses. And so the response, the scope of the response, I think, is it's almost like a warning sign of what would happen in the north if Hezbollah were to go all in on a conflict with Israel. You cannot allow those missiles to continue to be fired. You have to go in and find them and disable that capability. And that means, as T.F. Fehrenbach said, you got to put your troops in the mud on the ground and go into close combat And everything changes at that point in terms of the international perception of legality and what's right, because now you're not dealing with a 3-star general and a JAG colonel carefully assessing every target. Now you're dealing with a 20-year-old company commander in a Merkava tank deciding whether I fire that round into that building. And so the focal point of compliance drives down when you operate in combined arms maneuver operations, and people need to understand this. A lieutenant or a captain in Gaza next week is not going to have the luxury of analyzing every attack decision as if he's in the targeting cell of the IDF headquarters. He's going to have to make split-second judgments. And that's where that command and morality and the sense that I'm going to bring the fight to the enemy, but I'm always going to be looking for ways to mitigate risk becomes so very important from both a humanitarian and a strategic information perspective.
So I want to sort of jump back to a few points, expand upon them, especially given some of the questions we're getting from our audience. So as our 2018 report on Israel's next northern war, sort of in contrast to what we've seen in most past Gaza conflicts, would include a large combined arms ground maneuver sort of from the outset as part of a broader campaign. But now in light of what we're seeing potentially imminent in Gaza, I guess, General Trask, I'll start with you for this question. Why does Israel need to conduct a ground war? Is it because so much of Hamas leadership is in tunnels? And if so, so what if many of them are still alive after a conflict like the one you posit? At least we can eliminate their weapons and then deal with their leadership later. Is that worth potentially hundreds of Israeli casualties?
Yeah, I think that's the question Israelis are probably dealing with today. But I expect they're going to come to a conclusion that they just can't accept the fact that 2 years ago they left knowing that there were still 20,000 rockets and Hamas was still building more. And that they now have an operational security capability where they may be able to continue to do suicide raids in a way that's much more deadly than they were doing in the past. And they're just not going to be able to leave that situation in hand. And the only way to go in and make sure that you've got the rockets, that you have the capabilities, that you go look for guns, that you look for training facilities, that you look for the soldiers, the operators that are there. You're going to dig them out. In many cases, they have decent intelligence to know who they are. It's a matter of going in and digging them out and finding them. And of course, it will be ugly because Hamas will use their standard tactics and they will put themselves behind civilians and they will do everything they can to create an impression that the Israelis are wantonly going in and destroying civilian property and killing civilians. But I think they're going to determine, in my personal opinion, that that's what needs to happen this time. They just can't leave this time with Hamas as capable as they did 2 years ago.
So General Corn, I want to jump to you for this next audience question, which I think is a certainly for non-legal experts certainly a confounding one. If Hamas is not a state actor but instead a terrorist organization, how can it legally be held to the standards of international law? As a terrorist organization, aren't they rather just criminals?
Yeah. So let's stop for a minute. What we're talking about, the rules that apply to conflict, whether or not you characterize the group as a terrorist organization or not, has no relevance to me. International law is clear. If you're engaged in an armed conflict and you are an organized armed group, you are bound to the law like the state organized armed groups are bound. This is called equality of application. So the designation of, for example, the fact that the State Department has designated Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization is relevant for other purposes. For example, if people are sending money to Hamas, they're committing a federal criminal offense of providing material support to terrorism, or there are certain economic sanctions that apply to terrorist organizations. There's even a law called the Human Shields Act that allows for sanctions for organizations that use human shields. But what we're talking about is hostilities between two organized armed groups. And Hamas might not be a state, but there is no question that they are an organized armed group capable of engaging in hostilities, and that's what's happening. How are they bound to international law? Because under the international criminal law, you don't have to be operating on behalf of a state to be responsible for war crimes. And that includes not only the individual committing the war crimes, but the leaders who know or should know that their subordinates are going to commit those war crimes. They are accountable as if they committed them. And the entire Hamas chain of command bears responsibility for this barbarity because they unleashed subordinates with full knowledge, not only that they were probably directed to do this, but they knew that this was going to happen. So my advice is don't get wrapped up in the Hamas, a terrorist organization that has other diplomatic information and criminal consequences. Focus on the law that applies to the situation they're confronting now, which is an armed conflict between a state and an organized non-state armed group, and the rules apply equally. And one more point. I'm just writing before you came on a commentary. One of the things I'm already starting to notice is, as I said, international law requires equality of application of the law of war. But there almost seems to be in public commentary this instinct that there also has to be equality of condemnation. So people are coming out saying, yes, what Hamas did was terrible, it's a war crime, but it's almost like they have to find Israeli war crimes to talk about so we can be equal in our condemnation. That's not required by the law. I mean, sometimes you fight where one side is doing the right thing and the other side isn't. And it's ironic, isn't it, that this doesn't seem to be any difficulty in the conflict in Ukraine. I don't see a lot of criticism of Ukrainian war crimes. I see a lot of criticism of Russian war crimes. But there's something about this conflict where people seem to think if I'm going to condemn one side, I've got to find something to use to condemn the other side. And that's corrosive.
So I'm glad you brought that up. With a little bit of time we have left, I want to get to sort of implications more broadly, as you know, as we say, what debuts in Israel is usually coming next to a theater near you, and all of our reports on the Gaza conflicts here at GINSA contain findings and applicable implications for the United States. So I guess I'll start with you, General Trask, and then ask you, Professor Korn, as well. Maybe not just in the immediate term of what we're seeing now in Israel and Gaza, but drawing from our past reports and from past conflicts, what are America's adversaries learning from the way Hamas often seems to win the court of public opinion and gain strategic victories over Israel?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. It goes back to the thought that when you fight by the laws of armed conflict, you are restricting your capability in a way that makes it difficult sometimes. Whereas if you completely discard it and don't care about meeting that responsibility, and your focus, like Hamas, is simply to create an oppression globally, where your lead act, I think Jeff mentioned it earlier, where it's an information operation backed up with supporting military activity. It changes things, changes how you look at it. Part of that is, we talked about this with the Israelis when we were there 2 years ago, of how do you build that information campaign. Though in our case, it's typically supporting a military operation. It's the reverse, but it's still critical and important. And how you do it can have an effect on that. And I kind of alluded to that fact earlier, that I think Israel's doing it better this time, and they are getting more support this time for that reason. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to change the support for those that support the Palestinian cause, no matter what, all the time. That's always going to be there. But at least from a legacy perspective, when the social media account, if you go to the IDF's X account today, compare the way they did it in the last week versus the way they did it in May of 2021, it's a significant difference. And that legacy is there forever, to at least tell your side of the truth to historians that will go back later and evaluate the situation. But again, in this case, I really think it comes down to Gaza is not the most important thing for Israel. They have accepted that they are probably going to lose in the court of public opinion most often, and that's not their biggest concern. Their biggest concern is Iran. Iran supports Hamas. Iran supports Hezbollah in the north. Jinsa has an effort ongoing right now to increase the leverage against Iran and prevent them from creating a nuclear program, a nuclear weapon. I know that was one of the questions that we may or may not be able to get to, but that's an important issue, and it's a bipartisan issue in our government to maintain that support. There are folks on both sides of the aisle that are telling the administration the same thing. Jinsa has been part of that drumbeat as well, and that is where geostrategically why Benny Gantz and Netanyahu have come together in this regard, because they both realize that's the real threat, and that's in the big picture what they have to focus on.
Professor Corn, is there anything you'd like to add on the implications for the U.S. going forward? Especially, I think we've seen an amplification of disinformation on a lot of social media over time. It seems to be a pretty solid trend line, and how that might be exploited by U.S. adversaries.
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of points, right? Even if we're looking at conventional adversaries, they see the value of unconventional operations, right? The ability to be more adaptive than your enemy. And I think the reports have identified certain capabilities that the United States should be beefing up. For example, how to deal with short range air defense, counter drone operations, these type things. I think more fundamentally, the real lesson is one we're yet to see, and that is going to be, how do we assess compliance with the law? As I said earlier, when the decisive element in that compliance is not a general in a targeting cell, but a lieutenant with a platoon in the dirt. And I think the implication for the United States is very clear, that the type of conflict we're anticipating in the future is going to return more to kind of the Cold War era of combined arms maneuver operations. And we have to start thinking that what's changed between 1980 and today is the international expectation of compliance with the law. I mean, when I was a young officer in 1983, nobody talked about the law of war when we talked about having to fight the Soviet Union. But that is indispensable now. So we have to I strongly believe this, we really have to rethink the way we train junior leaders in the understanding of their role in the strategic dynamic. And I suspect the junior leaders in the IDF are aware of this, and they understand their obligation. But I think this is going to be one of the important lessons here, that the way we think about law, legal compliance, and dealing with enemies who don't care about the law has to shift a little bit from kind of the deliberate, no disrespect to my Air Force general, but kind of the deliberate air and missile operation context to the combined arms maneuver context, because I think the focal point of compliance shifts with it.
So I get in the few minutes we have left, I want to squeeze in a few more shots before the buzzer from our audience. General Trask, I'll pose this one to you. Are there sound tactics that direct how the IDF can enter Gaza so that they can create safe zones for the IDF and pinch Hamas into an untenable position?
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to be what they're going to try to do. However, because it is so tightly packed in an urban situation, it's going to be really difficult. But I'm sure that will be the intent. It will be to try to create zones operationally where they can operate from inside the city. But the way that Hamas is dispersed in everybody's basement, in everybody's apartment building, in every part of the city, that's going to be really challenging. And it's just going to be a block by block, very difficult slog through that process. But the thought of it is absolutely correct, and I'm sure that's what they'll try to do. There are areas that are inside Gaza that are on the edges of the city. I'm sure there will be certain areas where they will try to set up exactly that, to operate to and from those type of zones operationally. But it's really tough and challenging, and exactly what Professor Corn talked about is, it'll come down to those tactical leaders at the senior NCOs and junior officers making those decisions.
Professor Corey, is there anything you want to add on this point?
Well, I think also one of the things I hope that the IDF commanders are thinking about is not only setting up zones of operational safety, but also trying to figure out how to create some safe havens for civilians and the wounded and sick. I mean, they have nowhere to go. And as bad as Hamas is, the IDF commanders still have an obligation to take feasible measures to try and figure out some way to get some type of humanitarian assistance into the civilian population, not just from a moral standpoint, but also strategically. If you don't do that, it's going to be counterproductive.
Well, even operationally, Jeff, that, you know, by encouraging civilians to come through the line to an area where you are going to provide medical and food, it simplifies the tactical problem set as well if you can clear those civilians out. I expect that will probably be something that will happen in the north near the checkpoint, near the border crossing area there. Well, they will set up a zone, encourage civilians to come through. It'll be a type of refugee area, but at least one where people are being provided for medically and food and other needs.
Jonathan, I regret I'm going to have to sign off because I have another meeting I have to get to, but it was a pleasure. Your questions were phenomenal, and it's always nice to be on an event with General Trask. So nice seeing you, sir.
Yes,
Good to
thank you
see
very
you,
much,
Jeff.
Professor Corn. Thank you, General Trask, for your participation today, and we look forward to seeing the rest of you on a future GINSA webinar, and there will be a series of those next week on both updates on the conflict and various other aspects related to it. So thank you again to Professor Corn and General Trask for your time today. Thank you all for our audience for joining in today, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.